Fire that incompetent fool, or I'll destroy this place. Atlas Grimm's voice sliced through Azure Dining like a blade. The tech billionaire slammed his platinum card down, making crystal glasses tremble. Every server cowered. Every manager bowed. The man in the $10,000 suit owned this room through pure terror, except for one person. Wren Sinclair, a 25-year-old black waitress with straight hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, stood behind the bar, polishing wine glasses. Her dark eyes studied the billionaire's performance with quiet intelligence. While others trembled, she noticed what they missed. How Atlas clutched an old cracked phone like his life depended on it. When the phone buzzed with a desperate message, his mask slipped. What was this powerful man really hiding? And why did someone who destroyed careers for fun look terrified of a simple text? The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across Azure Dining's pristine white tablecloths, each surface reflecting the quiet terror that had settled over the restaurant like morning fog. Servers moved with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled against Italian marble floors, eyes carefully averted from table 12 in the corner where Atlas Grimm held court every Friday evening, transforming the city's most exclusive dining room into his personal theater of humiliation. Wren Sinclair adjusted the black apron tied around her waist and counted the wine glasses she'd polished for the third time tonight. 27. The repetitive motion kept her hands busy while her mind cataloged the subtle signs of distress rippling through her co-workers. Marcus, the sommelier, had developed a nervous tic in his left eye. Sarah, barely 19, and new to fine dining, had excused herself to the bathroom twice in the past hour. Even Phoenix Holt, their unflappable manager, with 3 decades of restaurant experience, had retreated to his office rather than face the inevitable confrontation brewing at table 12. "The steak is overcooked," Atlas's voice carried across the dining room with the precision of a blade. "Did I stutter when I said medium rare? Do you understand English, or should I request someone more competent?" The young waiter, Tommy, fresh out of culinary school with dreams bigger than his paycheck, stood frozen beside the billionaire's table. His face had drained of color, leaving him pale against his crisp white shirt. The perfectly prepared ribeye sat untouched on bone china steam, still rising from its surface. Wren could see from her position that the meat was exactly as ordered, the pink center visible through Atlas's deliberately dramatic cut. "I apologize, sir." Tommy managed his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient jazz. "I can have the kitchen prepare another." "Another." Atlas leaned back in his chair, designer suit jacket falling open to reveal a shirt that probably cost more than Tommy's monthly rent. "You think throwing money at incompetence solves everything? This is precisely what's wrong with your generation. No accountability. No standards." The other diners had stopped eating, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they witnessed the verbal assault. Wren recognized several faces: a federal judge, 2 city council members, the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company. These people came to Azure Dining for its discretion as much as its cuisine. Yet none intervened as Atlas systematically destroyed a young man's dignity for sport. Tommy's hands shook as he reached for the plate. In his nervousness, his thumb brushed against the rim, and Atlas struck like a viper. "Don't touch my food with your filthy hands." The billionaire's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you have any idea what I pay for this experience? What your carelessness costs me?" Wren set down her polishing cloth with deliberate calm. She'd worked in restaurants for 7 years, from dive bars in community college to this pinnacle of culinary excellence. She'd seen entitled customers before, witnessed the casual cruelty that accompanied extreme wealth. But something about Atlas Grimm felt different. Manufactured. Like watching a bad actor oversell his lines. She studied his face as he continued his tirade, noting the way his jaw muscles tensed with effort rather than genuine anger. His perfectly styled hair never moved despite his animated gestures. Most telling were his eyes cold and calculating, constantly scanning the room to gauge his audience's reaction. This wasn't rage. This was performance art. "Get your manager," Atlas commanded, dismissing Tommy with a wave of his manicured hand. "I want this incompetent fool fired immediately. Azure Dining's reputation depends on maintaining standards, not employing charity cases." Tommy hurried away, nearly colliding with a busboy in his haste to escape. Wren watched the young man disappear into the kitchen, knowing he was probably fighting back tears. Another casualty of Atlas Grimm's weekly reign of terror. She'd lost count of how many servers had quit after encounters with the tech mogul, their confidence shattered by his surgical precision in finding and exploiting their insecurities. Phoenix emerged from his office with the resigned expression of a man walking to his own execution. At 54, he'd managed some of the city's finest establishments, earning respect through fairness and professionalism. Watching him approach Atlas's table with shoulders slightly hunched felt like witnessing a proud lion forced to bow before a hyena. "Mr. Grimm," Phoenix said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I understand there's been an issue with your meal." "Issue?" Atlas laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "That's what you call having my evening ruined by amateur hour service. I've brought potential investors here tonight, Phoenix. Do you comprehend how this reflects on my judgment?" Wren glanced around the dining room, but saw no companions at Atlas's table. The man dined alone every Friday, yet always claimed to be entertaining important guests. Another layer of his carefully constructed fiction. "I sincerely apologize," Phoenix replied, maintaining his professional composure. "We'll certainly comp your meal, and money isn't the solution to everything," Atlas interrupted, echoing his earlier condemnation of Tommy. "I want accountability. That waiter doesn't belong in an establishment of this caliber. His termination would send the right message about Azure Dining's commitment to excellence." As Phoenix struggled to respond without compromising his employee's livelihood, Wren noticed something that made her breath catch. Atlas's hand moved to his jacket pocket, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his confident demeanor. As he shifted position, something small and dark tumbled from the silk lining, bouncing once against the marble floor before sliding under the neighboring table. A phone. Not the latest model smartphone she'd expect a tech billionaire to carry, but an older Samsung with a cracked screen protector. The device looked years old, worn from heavy use, completely incongruous with Atlas's image of cutting-edge sophistication. She moved without thinking, approaching the fallen object with the same casual efficiency she used to clear tables. Her fingers closed around the phone just as Atlas realized what had happened. For one unguarded moment, panic flashed across his features, raw, desperate terror that stripped away his carefully maintained mask. "That's mine," he said quickly, his composure already reassembling itself. But Wren had seen the crack in his armor, and she filed that moment away like a secret weapon. "Of course," she replied smoothly, rising from her crouch. As she handed him the device, the screen lit up with an incoming notification. Her eyes caught the preview of a text message. "Please call me back. I need help. The doctors say." Atlas snatched the phone away before she could read more, but damage was done. His fingers fumbled with the power button, shutting off the display with trembling hands that betrayed the steady voice he used to continue berating Phoenix. Wren returned to her station behind the bar, mind racing with questions. Who sent that desperate message? Why would a billionaire carry such an outdated device? And why did the preview of that text make Atlas Grimm, a man who terrorized servers for sport, look genuinely afraid? She resumed polishing wine glasses, each circular motion helping her think. Tomorrow was her day off, but tonight had given her a puzzle she couldn't ignore. Atlas Grimm wore his cruelty like expensive cologne. But underneath that designer exterior, something human and fragile was struggling to breathe. For the first time since she'd started working at Azure Dining, Wren found herself looking forward to his next visit. Because now she knew what others had missed, the monster everyone feared was just a man running from something. and she intended to find out what. Saturday morning found Wren curled in her studio apartment's single armchair laptop, balanced on her knees, as rain streaked the windows overlooking downtown's maze of brick and steel. Coffee grew cold in her favorite mug, while she dove deeper into the digital rabbit hole that was Atlas Grimm's carefully curated public persona. Forbes articles painted him as a self-made tech visionary. Business Weekly featured him on covers with headlines like, "The New Titans of Silicon Valley," yet every photograph showed the same calculated smile and impeccable styling. Something felt rehearsed about it all. The interviews contained identical polished anecdotes, repeated word for word across different publications. His company's founding story had the artificial perfection of a marketing campaign rather than entrepreneurial reality. Most curious was the complete absence of his background before age 25, as if Atlas Grimm had materialized, fully formed into the business world without a past. She clicked through social media profiles, corporate biographies, investment prospectuses. New York City featured prominently in his origin story, private schools in Manhattan, summers in the Hamptons, a family dynasty in finance. Yet something nagged at her about last night's phone, about that desperate text message, and the genuine terror that had flickered across his features. Her search led her to a tech blog from 6 years ago, buried deep in Google's results. The article mentioned Atlas's company acquiring a Detroit-based startup for its encryption technology. Detroit. The word stuck in her mind like a splinter. By noon, Wren had compiled an impressive dossier on Atlas Grimm's public life, while learning absolutely nothing about the man himself. The digital trail felt sterile, corporate, lacking the authentic messiness that marked real human existence. No childhood friends sharing memories on social platforms. No college roommates posting throwback photos. No evidence of the relationships and small triumphs that typically littered internet footprints of people their age. Her phone buzzed. Tommy's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with growing concern. "They fired me," he said without preamble, his voice hollow with defeat. "Phoenix called this morning. Said they had to make difficult staffing decisions to maintain Azure dining standards." Wren closed her laptop, with enough force to rattle her coffee mug. "That bastard actually got you fired. Phoenix tried to fight for me, I think, but the owner received a call this morning. Apparently, Mr. Grimm has significant influence with the investment group that backs the restaurant. They couldn't risk losing his business over one waiter." The casual cruelty settled in her stomach like lead. Atlas had destroyed a young man's career for sport, wielding his wealth like a weapon against someone who couldn't defend himself. She thought about Tommy's dreams of opening his own restaurant someday, about the student loans that would go unpaid. "I'm sorry, Tommy. This isn't about you or your performance. You know that, right?" "Yeah," he said, though uncertainty colored his voice. I've never encountered someone who seemed to enjoy causing pain. It was like watching a documentary about sharks, cold-blooded and efficient." After ending the call, Wren stared at her reflection in the black laptop screen. She'd witnessed Atlas's cruelty firsthand, but hearing about its aftermath made her decision crystallize with sharp clarity. Men like him operated through intimidation because they counted on their victims' silence, relying on people being too afraid or too powerless to fight back. But she wasn't powerless. She had something Atlas didn't know about that moment of genuine fear when his phone had revealed cracks in his perfect facade. Monday evening brought her back to Azure Dining's polished sanctuary, where the weekend's events seemed like distant nightmares. The restaurant operated with its usual efficiency servers, gliding between tables, with choreographed precision. Phoenix had already hired Tommy's replacement, a middle-aged woman named Claire, whose experienced hands and confident bearing suggested she wouldn't intimidate easily. Wren was arranging fresh flowers in the bar area when Atlas made his entrance. 7:30 exactly on schedule. The Lamborghini's growl outside had announced his arrival. giving the staff time to prepare like actors taking their marks before a difficult scene. He wore charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, hair styled to perfection, shoes polished to mirror brightness. Everything about his appearance screamed wealth and power, yet Ren found herself studying the details others missed. The way his left hand fidgeted with his watch, how his eyes swept the room with predatory calculation rather than the relaxed confidence of someone truly comfortable in their skin. "Good evening, Mr. Grimm." Phoenix greeted him with professional warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your usual table is ready." "Actually," Atlas said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of manufactured authority, "I'd prefer table 6 tonight. The lighting's better for reviewing contracts." Ren knew table 6 offered a clear view of the bar area where she worked. Coincidence seemed unlikely. As Atlas settled into his new position, she noticed him pull out 2 phones, the latest iPhone for show, and discreetly the older Samsung. He placed the newer device prominently on the table, while keeping the Samsung in his lap, out of sight from other diners. The gesture felt like watching someone maintain 2 separate identities. Her opportunity came when Atlas excused himself for what she assumed was a bathroom break. Instead of heading toward the restrooms, he slipped outside onto the restaurant's private patio. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she watched him pace while talking into the older phone, his carefully maintained composure dissolving into something raw and desperate. Ren stepped closer to the window, positioning herself behind a decorative column where she could observe without being seen. Atlas's free hand gestured frantically. As he spoke, his face contorted with an emotion she couldn't identify from this distance. Fear, guilt, desperation. Whatever the conversation concerned, it stripped away every layer of his public persona. When he returned to his table, Atlas's mask had reassembled itself, but not perfectly. Fine lines of stress creased the corners of his eyes, his movements carrying subtle tension that suggested barely controlled anxiety. Most telling was how he handled his wallet when paying for dinner, quickly, almost nervously, as if he didn't want anyone to glimpse its contents. But Ren had excellent vision, and in the brief moment when he opened the leather billfold, she caught sight of something that made her breath catch. A photograph, old and worn from handling, showing 2 children who looked nothing like the privileged Manhattan elite Atlas claimed as family. The boy in the picture had Atlas's dark hair and sharp features, but he wore a faded Detroit Lions t-shirt and stood in front of what appeared to be a modest working-class home. The girl beside him looked younger, maybe 8 or 9, with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Something about her expression reminded Ren of the desperate text message she'd glimpsed on the Samsung phone, that same quality of need of reaching out for help that might not come. Atlas pocketed the wallet quickly, but the damage was done. Ren had seen behind another layer of his carefully constructed lie, and the picture emerging was far more complex than simple cruelty. The man who destroyed careers for entertainment carried a worn photograph of children who clearly meant something to him, children whose existence contradicted everything about his public biography. As Atlas left Azure Dining that night, Ren made a mental note of his license plate and the precise time of his departure. Tomorrow, she would continue her investigation. But now she had something more substantial than internet searches and speculation. She had proof that Atlas Grimm was living a lie so comprehensive that it required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant cruelty to keep others from looking too closely. The question was why? What was he hiding that required such elaborate deception? And who were the children in that photograph? She intended to find out. Tuesday's lunch shift at Azure Dining moved with mechanical precision. Servers weaving between tables filled with power brokers, conducting business over $40 entrees. Ren polished silverware behind the bar, her movements automatic, while her mind churned through everything she'd discovered about Atlas Grimm. The worn photograph haunted her thoughts. 2 children in Detroit, worlds away from the Manhattan elite he claimed as family. The sound of expensive leather shoes against marble announced his arrival 3 hours early. Atlas strode through the entrance with his usual commanding presence, but Ren detected something different in his bearing, a slight rigidity in his shoulders, a fraction too much force in how he closed the door behind him. Whatever had prompted this unscheduled visit had him rattled. "Mr. Grimm," Phoenix materialized with practiced efficiency, though surprise flickered briefly across his features. "We weren't expecting you until this evening." "Change of plans," Atlas replied, his voice carrying its familiar edge of authority. "I need to handle some business calls in private. The usual table will suffice." As Phoenix led him across the dining room, Ren noticed Atlas's right hand repeatedly checking his jacket pocket, the same nervous gesture she'd observed Friday night when his Samsung had tumbled to the floor. Whatever he kept in that pocket was more important than the expensive iPhone he displayed like a status symbol. She busied herself organizing wine bottles, while Atlas settled into his corner table, positioning himself with clear sight lines to the entrance and the bar. His body language suggested a man preparing for combat rather than conducting routine business. When he pulled out both phones, the newer device remained silent on the white tablecloth, while the Samsung buzzed with constant notifications that made his face progressively paler. "Excuse me," Ren said, approaching his table with a water glass. "Can I get you started with anything while you wait?" Atlas looked up from his phone, and she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine exhaustion. The calculated cruelty was still there, but underneath it lurked a bone-deep weariness that suggested weeks of sleepless nights. "Just coffee," he said. "Black, strong." As she turned to leave, his Samsung lit up with another notification. The angle allowed her to glimpse part of the message preview. "Nova, payment late this month. Doctors need—" "Actually," Atlas's voice stopped her mid-step, sharp, with barely controlled panic. "That phone, you didn't see anything, did you?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Ren turned back slowly, meeting his gaze with steady calm, despite her racing pulse. This was the moment that would define their relationship, whether she would remain safely invisible or become a threat he needed to eliminate. "See what?" she asked, letting genuine confusion color her voice. "I was focused on not spilling water on your table." Relief flooded his features so quickly she almost missed it. Atlas Grimm was terrified of what that phone might reveal, and his fear made him careless. "Of course," he said, his composure reassembling itself like armor clicking into place. "Bring that coffee, and perhaps you could recommend something for lunch. I'm not familiar with your afternoon menu." The lie came so smoothly she might have believed it if she hadn't watched him eat here dozens of times. But now she understood this wasn't about food. He was buying time, keeping her close while he figured out how much she'd seen. "The lobster bisque is excellent," she offered, "and our chef does wonderful things with duck confit." "Perfect. Both, then." He waved dismissively, but his eyes never left her face, analyzing her expression for signs of deception. In the kitchen, Ren's hands trembled slightly as she poured his coffee. Nova. The name from the text message felt significant, though she couldn't yet place why. Payment late, doctors. Someone needed medical care, and Atlas was responsible for covering the costs. But who? When she returned with his coffee, Atlas was deep in conversation on the Samsung, his voice low and urgent. She caught fragments as she approached. "Understand the situation. Doing everything I can. Just need more time." He ended the call abruptly when he noticed her presence, shutting off the phone with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. The mask of arrogant confidence had slipped again, revealing something raw and human underneath. "Your coffee, sir," she said, setting the cup down with careful precision. "Thank you." He lifted the cup to his lips, and she noticed something that made her breath catch. Beneath his expensive Armani sleeve, barely visible at his wrist, was the edge of a different watch. Not the Rolex he wore for show, but something older, simpler. A Timex with a worn leather band that had seen years of daily wear. The detail felt significant. Another crack in his carefully constructed facade. Men like Atlas Grimm didn't wear $20 watches, especially hidden beneath designer sleeves, unless they had sentimental value from before the money, before the lies, before Atlas Grimm had reinvented himself into existence. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked. "Actually, yes." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. "You've been working here how long?" "Almost 2 years. And in that time, have you found the staff here to be discreet?" The question felt loaded with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. "Azure Dining values client privacy above everything else. It's why people like you choose to dine here." "People like me," he repeated, something bitter creeping into his voice. "Yes, I suppose it is." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of his lunch, which he picked at without enthusiasm. The duck confit remained largely untouched, while he checked his Samsung obsessively, each new notification drawing fresh lines of stress across his forehead. Ren refilled his coffee cup twice, using each opportunity to study the man beneath the expensive veneer. The nervous energy radiating from him felt familiar. She'd seen it in her own mirror during college when scholarship money ran thin, and she'd worked 3 jobs to stay afloat. The fear of not having enough, of letting someone down, of being exposed as fundamentally inadequate. But Atlas Grimm was supposed to be worth hundreds of millions. What could possibly make a billionaire look like a struggling student, afraid of defaulting on loans? As he prepared to leave, Atlas pulled out a wallet thick with credit cards and cash. For a brief moment, as he sorted through bills, that worn photograph became visible again. The 2 children, the modest house, the Detroit Lions shirt. But this time, Ren noticed something else, a small detail that made everything click into place with startling clarity. The little girl in the photo was wearing a hospital bracelet. Atlas caught her staring and snapped the wallet shut, with enough force to crack the leather. "I trust this conversation will remain between us," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "Azure Dining's reputation depends on maintaining certain standards of discretion." "Of course, Mayor Grimm." But as he walked away, Ren knew she'd already decided. Whatever secret Atlas was protecting, whatever drove him to carry worn photographs and hidden watches and old phones that brought him nothing but anguish, she was going to uncover it. Because the cruelty he inflicted on others was just armor, and she'd seen enough cracks to know the man underneath was drowning. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected phone call that shattered Ren's usual routine. She was brewing coffee in her kitchen when her cell phone rang with Phoenix's name on the display, his voice tight with professional strain when she answered. "Ren, I need you to come in early today. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The carefully neutral tone told her everything she needed to know. Atlas Grimm had made his move. An hour later, she sat across from Phoenix in his cramped office above Azure Dining's main dining room, surrounded by filing cabinets and the lingering aroma of yesterday's bread service. Through the window, she could see the lunch prep crew, working with focused efficiency, unaware of the drama unfolding 1 floor above their heads. "Mr. Grimm called the owner this morning," Phoenix began, his weathered hands folded carefully on the desk between them. "He expressed serious concerns about your professionalism and suggested that your continued employment might compromise Azure Dining's reputation among our clientele." Ren kept her expression neutral, despite the fury building in her chest. What specific concerns did he raise? Invasion of privacy, inappropriate curiosity about his personal business. He mentioned that you seemed unusually interested in his phone conversations and personal effects. Phoenix's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news he didn't believe but couldn't ignore. He also indicated that you might be the type of employee who shares confidential information about our guests with outside parties. The accusation hit like a physical blow. In the restaurant industry, discretion was everything. Servers who gossiped about celebrity customers or business deals overheard during dinner service found themselves blacklisted from every quality establishment in the city. Atlas had chosen his weapon with surgical precision. "And the owner's response?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Phoenix's expression. "Mr. Castellano wants to avoid any complications that might affect our relationship with Mr. Grimm. The investment group that backs Azure Dining values his continued patronage very highly." Phoenix leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 54 years. "I've been instructed to place you on administrative leave, pending a full review of the situation." Ren felt the walls closing in around her with methodical precision. Atlas had wielded his influence like a scalpel, cutting away her income and professional reputation, without technically firing her. The administrative leave would stretch for weeks while he found ways to make the accusations stick, ensuring she'd never work in fine dining again. "I understand," she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'll clear out my locker." "Ren." Phoenix's voice stopped her at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't believe his accusations. You're one of the most professional servers I've ever supervised, but I have 23 other employees depending on their paychecks, and I can't risk their jobs for one person, no matter how unfair the situation." She nodded, understanding the impossible position Atlas had created. By targeting her employment, he had forced Phoenix to choose between protecting one server or preserving the livelihood of an entire staff. The billionaire's cruelty extended beyond personal vindictiveness into strategic warfare. Downstairs, as she collected her few personal items from the employee locker room, Ren's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw what happened. If you want to know more about our mutual friend, meet me at Riverside Park Bench 17 tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Someone who understands." She stared at the message for several minutes, weighing the risks against her burning need for answers. Someone else had noticed Atlas's deception, someone with information they were willing to share. But meeting a stranger in a public park felt like stepping deeper into whatever web of secrets surrounded the tech billionaire. Her decision crystallized when she remembered Tommy's hollow voice describing his termination the casual way Atlas had destroyed a young man's career for entertainment. If she backed down now, the billionaire would continue his reign of terror over Azure Dining's staff, secure in the knowledge that his wealth and influence made him untouchable. That evening, Ren sat in her apartment with her laptop open, diving deeper into the digital breadcrumbs that might lead her to the truth about Atlas Grimm. The name Nova had lodged in her memory like a splinter, and she systematically searched through hospital directories, social media platforms, and public records databases. Her persistence paid off near midnight when she found a hospital admission record from Detroit General Medical Center. Nova Grimm, 29 years old, admitted 3 months ago for complications related to chronic kidney disease. The patient required ongoing dialysis treatment and had been placed on the transplant waiting list. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The desperate text messages about late payments. The doctor references in fragmented conversations. The genuine terror in Atlas's eyes when his Samsung revealed glimpses of his hidden life. He was supporting someone's medical treatment, someone important enough to risk exposure for. But the hospital records raised new questions. If Nova was his sister, as the photograph suggested, why maintain such elaborate secrecy? Why not simply acknowledge her existence and pay for her care openly? What could possibly motivate him to create such an intricate web of deception around a family member's illness? Further research revealed more inconsistencies in Atlas's public biography. Corporate filings showed his company had been founded in Detroit, not New York, as his interviews claimed. Early business licenses listed an address in a working-class neighborhood near the auto plants miles from the affluent suburbs where tech entrepreneurs typically established their startups. The pattern emerging painted a picture of systematic identity reconstruction, as if Atlas Grimm had methodically erased his actual past and replaced it with a more palatable fiction. But why? What was so shameful about his Detroit origins that he'd rather terrorize innocent people than risk exposure? As dawn broke over the city, Ren printed out everything she'd discovered and organized the documents in chronological order. The evidence formed a compelling narrative of deception. but she still lacked the central piece that would explain his motivations. Tomorrow's meeting in Riverside Park might provide that missing element, or it might be a trap designed to silence her permanently. She dressed carefully for the encounter, choosing clothes that would help her blend into the park's usual population of joggers and dog walkers. Her phone contained photos of all her research uploaded to a cloud storage account that would preserve the information even if something happened to her. If Atlas Grimm thought he could intimidate her into silence, he was about to discover the difference between attacking vulnerable restaurant workers and confronting someone who'd grown up fighting for everything she'd achieved. At 11:30, Wren left her apartment and walked toward Riverside Park, carrying with her the growing certainty that today would mark a turning point in whatever game Atlas had been playing. He'd escalated their conflict by targeting her livelihood, but in doing so, he'd also revealed just how much he feared the truth coming to light. That fear would be his downfall, because while Atlas Grimm might have money and influence, Wren Sinclair had something more powerful: the absolute conviction that some secrets were too destructive to remain hidden, and some bullies needed to be stopped regardless of the personal cost. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. Riverside Park sprawled along the eastern edge of downtown, its walking paths winding between ancient oak trees and carefully maintained flower beds that attracted families, joggers and office workers seeking brief escapes from urban intensity. Bench 17 sat in a secluded alcove overlooking the river, partially hidden by drooping willow branches that created natural privacy for sensitive conversations. Wren arrived 10 minutes early, positioning herself with clear sight lines to all approaching paths while appearing to read a paperback novel. The morning sun filtered through leaves overhead, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that would make surveillance photography difficult. Whatever information her mysterious contact planned to share, they'd chosen their location with careful consideration for security. At precisely noon, a woman in her early 40s approached the bench with the measured stride of someone accustomed to hospital corridors. She wore scrubs beneath a lightweight jacket, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested long shifts and little time for vanity. When she sat down beside Wren, her expression carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed too much suffering. "You're the waitress from Azure Dining," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a slight Midwestern accent that felt familiar after years of working with customers from across the country. "The one asking questions about Atlas Grimm. How do you know about that?" Wren asked, closing her book, but keeping her eyes forward, watching the river flow past while they spoke. "Because I'm the one he calls every week begging for updates on his sister's condition. I'm Linda Morrison, head nurse in the dialysis unit at Detroit General Medical Center." She pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be patient files. "Nova Grimm has been under our care for 8 months now, ever since her kidneys started failing from complications related to lupus." The name confirmation sent electricity through Wren's nervous system. Nova Grimm, not just a random contact, but Atlas's sister fighting for her life in a Detroit hospital, while her brother terrorized restaurant workers 300 miles away. "He sends money for her treatment," Linda continued, "but always through anonymous wire transfers. Never visits. Never calls her directly. She doesn't even know the payments are coming from him. As far as Nova's concerned, her brother disappeared 15 years ago and never looked back." "Why?" Wren asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal something fundamental about Atlas's carefully constructed persona. "Because Atlas Grimm died in Detroit 22 years ago, at least as far as anyone in his old neighborhood knows. The boy who left was named Andy Kowalski, son of a laid-off auto worker who drank himself to death when the plants closed. Andy was 17 when he aged out of foster care, leaving behind a 12-year-old sister who still believed he'd come back for her someday." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Atlas hadn't just reinvented his image, he'd abandoned his entire identity including the sister who depended on him. The cruelty he inflicted on others was projection punishment for the guilt that consumed him every time he looked in the mirror and saw the brother who'd chosen success over family. Nova still talks about him, Linda said, her voice softening with professional compassion. Wonders if he's alive if he ever thinks about her. She has no idea that her anonymous benefactor is the same brother who left her behind in the system when she was just a kid. Ren felt sick imagining the betrayal, the abandonment that had shaped two lives in fundamentally different directions. Why are you telling me this? Because Nova's running out of time. She needs a kidney transplant, and the waiting list is long. Family donors are always the best option, but as far as she knows, she doesn't have any family left. Linda's fingers tightened around her tablet. I've been watching Atlas destroy himself with guilt for months, sending money like it can buy absolution while his sister dies thinking she's alone in the world. Have you tried contacting him directly? Multiple times. He hangs up the moment I mention bringing them together. His assistant has instructions to screen all calls from Detroit area codes. Linda's frustration bled through her professional demeanor. He's trapped himself in a prison of his own making, and Nova's paying the price for his cowardice. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching a family of ducks paddle past, while Ren processed the magnitude of Atlas's deception. The man who wielded cruelty like a weapon was himself the victim of choices he'd made as a desperate teenager, trapped between the identity he'd created and the family he'd abandoned. There's something else, Linda said, pulling up another file on her tablet. Nova's been asking questions lately about hiring a private investigator to find her brother. She saved up almost $3,000 from her disability payments money she should be spending on medication and proper nutrition. The irony was devastating. While Atlas spent millions maintaining his false identity, his sister was preparing to sacrifice her health for the chance to reconnect with the brother who was already funding her care from the shadows. What do you want me to do? Ren asked. You've gotten closer to him than anyone in years. He's terrified enough of exposure to attack your livelihood, which means you've touched something real beneath all that armor. Linda handed her a business card with the hospital's contact information. Make him understand that hiding behind money isn't enough anymore. Nova deserves to know her brother's alive, and Atlas deserves the chance to be the family she's always believed he could be. As Linda prepared to leave, she paused and looked directly at Ren for the first time. There's one more thing you should know. Nova's lupus is progressing faster than we initially predicted. Without a transplant in the next 6 months, she's going to die waiting for a stranger's kidney, while her brother lives 300 miles away, convinced that his guilt is more important than her life. After Linda disappeared down the walking path, Ren remained on the bench, staring at the river, while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Atlas's cruelty made perfect sense. Now every attack on vulnerable service workers was really an attack on the vulnerable boy he'd once been, the one who'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation. But understanding his motivations didn't excuse the damage he'd inflicted on others. Tommy's shattered confidence, her own professional reputation, the climate of fear he'd created at Azure Dining. None of that was justified by his personal tragedy. If anything, someone who understood abandonment and desperation should have shown more compassion for others facing similar struggles. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd memorized from Atlas's Samsung. Nova Grimm's direct line at the dialysis center. One call could shatter Atlas's carefully maintained secret force, him to confront the consequences of his choices. But it could also destroy whatever fragile hope kept him functional, potentially making him even more dangerous to the people around him. Instead, she opened her camera app and took a photo of Linda's business card, then typed a text message to the number Atlas had used to threaten her employment. I know about Nova. I know about Detroit. I know about Andy Kowalski. We need to talk before someone else gets hurt. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then sat back to wait for the explosion that would inevitably follow. Atlas Grimm had spent decades building walls around his past, but walls could be breached by someone determined enough to find the cracks. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with a response. Riverside Park bench, 17:30 minutes. Come alone, or I'll make sure you never work in this city again. Ren smiled grimly at the threat. He was still trying to intimidate her, still believing that fear was his most effective weapon. But she'd just learned something that changed everything. Atlas Grimm was more afraid of his own truth than she could ever be of his retaliation. The real conversation was about to begin. Atlas arrived at Riverside Park like a man walking to his execution. His usual commanding presence replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone carrying an unbearable weight. He'd abandoned his designer suit for dark jeans and a plain black sweater, as if preparing to shed the billionaire persona along with his expensive armor. When he sat down beside Ren on bench 17, she noticed his hands shaking, despite his attempts to project control. "How much do you know?" he asked, without looking at her, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "Enough," Ren replied. "Andy Kowalski from Detroit. Nova in dialysis. 22 years of lies built on abandoning the one person who needed you most." He flinched as if she'd struck him, his carefully maintained facade crumbling like wet sand. "You don't understand the situation. You have no idea what it was like. Then explain it to me." For several minutes, Atlas sat in silence, staring at the river, while internal battles played across his features. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the raw pain of wounds that had never properly healed. "My father worked at the Ford plant for 37 years before they shut it down. 37 years of getting up at 4 in the morning, coming home covered in grease and metal shavings, proud of putting food on our table with his hands." Atlas pulled out the old Samsung, turning it over in his palm like a talisman. "When the plant closed, he lost everything. His job, his pension, his sense of purpose. Started drinking to fill the empty hours." Ren remained silent, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever fragile courage he'd summoned to share this story. Nova was 7 when Dad died. Cirrhosis of the liver, though the official cause was listed as complications from depression. I was 15 trying to hold everything together while Mom worked 3 jobs just to keep us in that falling-apart house. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the worn photograph Ren had glimpsed at Azure Dining. This was taken the summer before everything fell apart. Nova's wearing that hospital bracelet because she'd just been diagnosed with juvenile lupus. Even then, she was fighting battles that weren't fair. The image showed 2 children who looked nothing like the privileged elite Atlas claimed as family. The boy wore a second-hand Detroit Lions shirt, his arm protectively around a little girl, whose bright smile couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. Behind them stood a modest ranch house with peeling paint and a chain-link fence, the kind of working-class home that disappeared when factories closed and families scattered. Mom died in a car accident when I was 17. Fell asleep at the wheel driving home from her night shift at the hospital laundry. Atlas's voice cracked slightly. "Social services wanted to split us up. Nova was supposed to go to a foster family in Grand Rapids while I aged out of the system and fended for myself. But you ran instead," Ren said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I had a partial scholarship to Wayne State for computer science, but it wasn't enough to support both of us. Foster care was temporary. Nova would have bounced between homes until she turned 18, probably ending up on the streets like so many kids who age out without family." He pulled his sleeve back, revealing the old Timex watch Linda had mentioned. "This was Dad's. The only thing of value he left behind. I pawned it 6 times during college, always buying it back when I could afford to." The detail hit Ren like a physical blow. Atlas Grimm, billionaire tech mogul, still wore his dead father's $20 watch beneath his designer sleeves, clinging to the memory of a man whose death had destroyed his family. I convinced myself that leaving was the only way to save us both. that I could succeed quickly, make enough money to come back and rescue Nova from whatever situation she'd landed in. His laugh was bitter, self-recriminating. Classic 17-year-old logic. I thought I could fix everything if I just worked hard enough. What happened instead? I changed my name, created a fictional background that would open doors in the tech world. Andy Kowalski from Detroit didn't get interviews at Silicon Valley startups, but Atlas Grimm from Manhattan's Upper East Side. People listened to him. He showed her the Samsung's cracked screen. I kept this phone with the Detroit area code so I could stay connected to home, but every time I tried to call Nova, I lost my nerve. What could I say? Sorry I abandoned you, but I'm working on becoming rich enough to justify it. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Atlas's cruelty toward service workers wasn't just projection, it was self-punishment attacking in others, the vulnerability he'd chosen to abandon in his sister. By the time I'd actually made serious money, Nova was in her 20s and had built a life without me. She'd survived foster care, finished community college, started working as a medical technician. I told myself she was better off without the brother who'd left her behind. He pulled up a text thread on the Samsung, showing months of messages from Nova that he'd never answered. Then her lupus got worse, and suddenly she needed help. I could provide anonymously, but couldn't give openly, because admitting you're her brother would mean admitting you're Andy Kowalski, Ren said. Everything I've built depends on the Atlas Grimm story, the investors, the business relationships, the social connections. They're all based on a lie that would collapse if people knew the truth. His voice dropped to a whisper. But the worst part is that I've become the lie. I'm not Andy anymore. I'm this cruel, empty shell who destroys people for entertainment because I can't stand looking at my own reflection. Ren studied his profile as he spoke, seeing past the expensive haircut and perfect skin to the frightened teenager who'd made an impossible choice and spent 22 years paying for it. Nova's dying, Atlas. She needs a kidney transplant, and family donors are the best option. I know. The words came out broken, defeated. I get weekly reports from her medical team. I've had myself tested. I'm a perfect match. But how do I explain appearing in her life now? How do I tell her that her anonymous benefactor is the brother she's been mourning for 2 decades? His Samsung buzzed with another notification, and this time he didn't hide it from her view. The message was from Nova herself. To whoever's been helping with my medical bills. I don't know who you are, but I need you to know that I have a brother somewhere. His name is Andy, and I still believe he's going to come home someday. If something happens to me, please try to find him and tell him I never stopped loving him. Atlas broke completely. Then 22 years of suppressed grief pouring out in wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. The billionaire's mask dissolved entirely, leaving behind a broken man who'd traded his soul for success and discovered too late that the price was everything that mattered. She's going to die thinking I abandoned her, he whispered through his tears. And maybe that's what I deserve. Ren reached over and took the Samsung from his trembling hands. No, she said firmly. What you deserve is the chance to be her brother again. And what Nova deserves is to know that someone loved her enough to sacrifice everything, even if the sacrifice was wrong. For the first time since she'd known him, Atlas Grimm looked at her with something approaching hope. The drive to Detroit Metro Airport passed in heavy silence, Atlas gripping the steering wheel of his Lamborghini with white knuckles, while Ren sat in the passenger seat, watching his internal battle play out in micro-expressions that flickered across his face. He'd insisted she come with him, claiming he needed someone to prevent him from turning back at the last moment. The admission revealed just how fragile his resolve had become after 22 years of carefully constructed distance. I bought a ticket under my real name, he said, as they pulled into the airport parking garage. Andrew Kowalski. I haven't used that identity since college. How does it feel? Ren asked, though she could see the answer in his trembling hands as he turned off the engine. Terrifying. Like I'm about to discover whether Andy Kowalski still exists underneath all the Atlas Grimm bullshit, or if I killed him so completely that there's nothing left worth saving. In the departure lounge, Atlas pulled out the Samsung phone and scrolled through years of unanswered messages from Nova, his face growing paler with each desperate attempt at connection he'd ignored. The texts painted a portrait of a young woman struggling with chronic illness, while maintaining hope that her vanished brother might someday return. The most recent messages had taken on an urgency that made his breathing grow shallow. "She sent this 3 days ago," he said, showing Ren the screen. "Andy, I know you probably won't get this, but I'm scared. The doctors say my kidneys are failing faster than expected. I keep dreaming about that summer we spent building a treehouse in Mrs. Patterson's backyard, how you promised we'd always take care of each other. I hope wherever you are, you remember that I kept my promise. I never stopped believing in you." The message was followed by a photo that made Atlas's composure crumble completely. Nova had taken a selfie from her hospital bed, wearing a paper crown someone had made from medical charts, her smile radiant, despite the dialysis equipment visible in the background. Written on the crown in marker were the words, "Happy birthday, Andy," and yesterday's date. She remembered. He whispered, his voice breaking on the words. I forgot my own birthday, but she remembered. During the flight, Atlas stared out the window at clouds that reminded him of childhood afternoons, when he and Nova would lie on their backs in the small yard behind their house, making up stories about the shapes drifting overhead. She had always seen dragons and castles where he saw mathematical formations, her imagination transforming ordinary moments into adventures that made their circumstances feel less desperate. "Tell me about the treehouse," Ren said, sensing he needed to reconnect with memories that predated his transformation into Atlas Grimm. "Mrs. Patterson lived next door. She was this tiny Polish woman who'd lost her husband in Korea and never had kids of her own. When she saw Nova struggling with her lupus diagnosis, she decided we needed a project to distract us from all the medical appointments and worry." His eyes softened as he spoke, accessing a part of himself that had been locked away for decades. "She provided the lumber and tools, but made us do all the work ourselves. Said kids needed to learn that beautiful things required effort and patience." The memory seemed to steady him, reminding him of the boy who'd cared more about his sister's happiness than his own social status or future prospects. "We spent that entire summer sawing boards and hammering nails, arguing about whether the roof should be flat or peaked, painting the walls with leftover house paint Mrs. Patterson had stored in her garage. Nova insisted on painting flowers around the windows even though I thought they looked ridiculous." He smiled for the first time since she'd known him, the expression transforming his features completely. She was right, of course. They made it feel like home. As their plane descended toward Detroit, Atlas grew increasingly agitated, checking his phone obsessively for updates from the hospital, while his leg bounced with nervous energy. The city sprawled below them, a mixture of urban decay and stubborn renewal that reflected the complicated relationship between past and present he was about to confront. "What if she doesn't forgive me?" he asked as they collected their luggage. "What if 22 years is too long, and I've become someone she can't love anymore? Then you'll deal with that," Ren replied. "But hiding from the possibility isn't protecting either of you anymore. It's just prolonging the pain." Detroit General Medical Center rose from the urban landscape like a fortress of hope and desperation, its windows reflecting afternoon sunlight that did nothing to warm the October chill settling over the city. Inside, the familiar hospital smells of disinfectant and worry triggered sense memories that made Atlas stumble slightly as they approached the information desk. Linda Morrison appeared before they could ask directions, her professional composure barely concealing the emotions underlying this reunion she'd orchestrated through carefully planted information and strategic conversations. "She's in room 412, Linda said simply. "She just finished her afternoon dialysis session, so she'll be tired but alert. I told her she has a visitor, but I didn't specify who." They rode the elevator in silence, Atlas's reflection in the polished steel doors, showing a man stripped of all pretense, reduced to his essential components of love and fear and desperate hope. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, he hesitated for a moment that stretched into eternity before forcing himself to step forward. Room 412 contained medical equipment that couldn't disguise the personal touches Nova had used to make the space her own. Children's drawings covered one-wall artwork from the pediatric ward, where she volunteered when her health permitted. A small bookshelf held worn paperbacks and the kind of inspirational texts people read when facing mortality at 29. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph of 2 children building something out of scrap lumber, their faces bright with shared purpose. Nova was sleeping when they entered, her face peaceful, despite the pallor that spoke of months spent fighting a losing battle against her own body. She looked exactly like the little girl in Atlas's memory, only translated into adult features that carried the same bright intelligence and stubborn optimism that had sustained her through foster care and chronic illness. "Nova," Atlas said softly, his voice carrying 22 years of accumulated love and regret. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating each day's energy reserves. When she saw him standing beside her bed, confusion flickered across her features, followed by a recognition so profound it seemed to stop time itself. "Andy," she whispered the word containing every prayer she'd ever made and every dream she'd refused to abandon. "I'm here," he said, dropping to his knees beside the bed so their eyes were level. "I'm finally here, and I'm never leaving again." When Nova reached out to touch his face, confirming that her brother had actually returned from whatever distant place had claimed him, Atlas felt the last walls around his heart crumble completely. The man who'd terrorized restaurant workers for sport was gone, replaced by someone ready to remember what it meant to love another person more than his own fear. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her smile radiant enough to light the entire room. "I always knew." 6 months later, Wren stood behind the counter of her own restaurant, watching the lunch crowd fill tables. She'd arranged herself in the converted warehouse space that had become Sinclair's kitchen. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating exposed brick walls, decorated with local artists' work and mismatched furniture that created an atmosphere of comfortable authenticity rather than manufactured elegance. The kidney transplant had been successful beyond all medical expectations. Atlas had been a perfect match for Nova, and their shared recovery had given both siblings time to rebuild a relationship that transcended the Atlas grim persona entirely. The billionaire's public identity remained intact for business purposes, but the man who visited his sister twice weekly in Detroit had reclaimed something fundamental that no amount of wealth could purchase. "Table 6 is ready for their check," called Marcus, the former sommelier, from Azure Dining, who'd become Sinclair's kitchen's beverage director, when Atlas's scholarship fund had allowed him to pursue advanced certification. The program, established quietly through Atlas's foundation, provided educational opportunities for service industry workers who demonstrated exceptional character despite facing financial hardship. Tommy emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of his signature mac and cheese, the recipe he'd perfected during culinary school before Atlas's cruelty had nearly destroyed his confidence. The young chef had been Wren's first hire when she'd opened the restaurant, with Atlas's backing, though the investment had come with strict conditions that preserved her independence and creative control. "The food blogger from Metro Weekly wants to interview you about the community outreach program," Tommy said, setting down his tray, with the careful precision he'd maintained, despite no longer fearing arbitrary criticism. "Apparently word's getting out about the free meals for hospital workers and the job training initiatives." Wren nodded, though she preferred letting the work speak for itself rather than seeking publicity for programs designed to address systemic inequalities in the service industry. The restaurant's success had allowed her to hire people like Claire, the experienced server, who'd replaced Tommy at Azure Dining before joining Sinclair's kitchen as floor manager when Atlas's foundation provided funding for her dream of opening a culinary training center for at-risk youth. The afternoon brought its usual rhythm of satisfied customers and staff members who worked with the easy confidence of people treated with dignity and paid living wages. Atlas had insisted on funding the restaurant's initial startup costs through a no-interest loan that would convert to a grant if certain community impact metrics were met within 3 years. The arrangement allowed Ren to focus on creating something meaningful rather than merely profitable. At 4 o'clock, a familiar figure appeared at the entrance, though the man who walked through Sinclair's kitchen bore little resemblance to the predator who'd once terrorized Azure Dining's staff. Atlas wore simple khakis and a blue button-down shirt, his expensive shoes replaced by comfortable sneakers that suggested someone more concerned with functionality than image. Most significantly, his father's Timex watch was now worn openly on his wrist, no longer hidden beneath designer sleeves. "How's Nova today?" Ren asked, as he took his usual seat at the counter, the spot that offered the best view of the open kitchen, where he could observe the collaborative energy that had replaced the fear-based hierarchy of traditional fine dining establishments. "Good days and challenging ones, but more good ones lately," he replied, pulling out his phone to show her a photo Nova had taken that morning. She started working part-time at the dialysis center, helping other patients navigate the emotional aspects of treatment. Turns out, surviving abandonment and chronic illness gives you useful perspective on resilience. The image showed Nova in scrubs, surrounded by patients who looked significantly more hopeful than the isolated figures typically associated with long-term medical care. Her smile carried the same radiant quality Ren remembered from the hospital room, but now it reflected health rather than determined optimism in the face of mortality. "She wants to meet you properly," Atlas continued, "not as the person who helped orchestrate our reunion, but as the friend who gave me permission to stop punishing myself for choices I made as a scared teenager." Tommy approached with Atlas's usual order, the mac and cheese that had once represented everything he disdained about working-class comfort food, now served without irony or condescension. The transformation in both men's relationship to the dish reflected larger changes in how they understood the connections between food dignity and human worth. "The Phoenix situation resolved itself," Atlas said, between bites, referring to the former Azure Dining manager who'd been caught between protecting his staff and preserving his restaurant's financial stability. The new owners appreciated his integrity enough to offer him a significant raise and complete autonomy over hiring decisions. Apparently, ethical management has become a selling point in the current market. The news didn't surprise Ren, who'd watched Atlas systematically address the damage his former persona had inflicted on people's careers and confidence. The work was painstaking and sometimes rejected by individuals who preferred to process their trauma privately, but his commitment to making amends had proven more consistent than his previous cruelty. "Speaking of resolutions," Atlas said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something that belongs to you." He placed a folded document on the counter between them, an official letter from Azure Dining's ownership group formally apologizing for her wrongful termination and offering her previous position with a significant salary increase and management responsibilities. The gesture was meaningless from a practical standpoint, since Sinclair's kitchen had far exceeded her career expectations, but it represented something more valuable than money or status. Phoenix insisted on adding a personal note, Atlas said, pointing to handwritten text at the bottom of the formal apology. "He wanted you to know that your courage in confronting an unjust situation inspired him to implement new policies protecting staff from customer abuse. Zero tolerance for harassment regardless of the patron's spending power or social influence." Wren read the letter twice, not because she needed to understand its contents, but because she wanted to appreciate the larger implications of institutional change occurring beyond her individual situation. The ripple effects of standing up to Atlas's bullying had created safer working conditions for countless service industry employees who would never know her name. As evening approached and the restaurant prepared for its dinner service, Atlas prepared to leave for his weekly visit with Nova. The ritual had become sacred to both siblings, their Friday dinners serving as anchors in lives that had once been defined by absence and regret. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying 22 years of accumulated gratitude for the chance to become someone worthy of his sister's love. "Thank Nova," Wren replied. "She's the one who never stopped believing her brother was worth saving." Atlas smiled, not the calculated expression he'd once used to manipulate others, but something genuine and unguarded that reflected the peace he'd found in accepting his own humanity. As he walked toward the exit, Wren noticed other diners watching him with the casual indifference reserved for ordinary customers, rather than the fearful attention once commanded by his presence. Outside Detroit was rebuilding itself one project at a time, just as Atlas Grimm had rebuilt himself one honest conversation at a time. The work was slow and sometimes painful, but it created foundations strong enough to support whatever came next.